Gonna switch over to speaker, see how that looks. Welcome everybody to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension Wisconsin 4-H. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year by Zoom. Tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome back to Wednesday Night at the Lab, Malia Jones. Malia gave a talk a couple of years ago, but I'm really happy that she came back to talk about her work with the Dear Pandemic project. Malia, I'm going to ask you the 5 questions that I asked you a couple of years ago. Where were you born?
I was born in Hawaii.
Whoa, what island?
The Big Island in Kealakekua Bay.
Where is that?
That is on the west side of the island. It's not too far from Kona.
Very nice.
Yeah, it is very nice.
It's I spent half a day there once for 3 weeks. It was beautiful.
Well, actually, I didn't spend long there either. My parents left when I was a baby, but I got the name Malia out of it.
Oh, there you go. And then where'd you go to high school?
I went to high school in Pennsylvania, Great Valley High.
And where is that?
That's in a suburb of Philadelphia, in the city of Malvern at the end of the main line.
Very good. And then where'd you go for your undergrad and what'd you study?
I went to American University for my undergraduate in Washington, D.C. And I never did decide what to study, but so I ended up with 3 majors, but the one I usually reference is philosophy, and I studied ethics. So I was a latecomer to science, but yeah, I do have a degree in philosophy.
And then where'd you go for your advanced degrees?
So I did my master's in public health and my PhD in public health at UCLA, and a postdoc in preventive medicine and cancer prevention at the University of Southern California, also in Los Angeles. And
then when did you come to UW-Madison?
Yeah, last time I was here, I was kind of a newcomer to UW-Madison, I think, but it's coming up on, it's coming up on 6 years. In fact, this might be, we're very close to the anniversary of when I moved here 6 years ago.
Very good. So last March, you were one of the co-founders and are the editor-in-chief of this project called Dear Pandemic. We're looking forward to hearing the origin story, what's happened over the last 14 months and what you see coming up in the next month or 2 or 3, if you can see that far. So
yeah, well, I did bring my magic 8 ball, so I'll try and give you some good predictions about what the future holds.
That looked like an infinity symbol, not an 8. So I don't know.
Well, there you go. Maybe it's even better at making predictions. Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
I'm really excited to be here and talk about my work with Dear Pandemic. The last time I was at Wednesday Night at the Lab, I was talking about vaccine hesitancy, and here I am again. I'm going to be talking about vaccine hesitancy towards the end of this talk. So thanks so much. I see there are 30 people joining us here tonight, and I really appreciate you joining me. I know we're all really zoomed out, and I value the hour that we're going to spend together. So thanks for being here. If you have questions, we'll have time for Q&A at the end, and you can also put them in the chat, and then we'll get to them. I can see if I can answer them as we go too. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about Dear Pandemic, which is a COVID-19 social media project that I accidentally founded 15 months ago. And what we do is provide curated, comprehensive, and timely information about COVID-19 to a general audience on social media. And Dear Pandemic is an all-woman interdisciplinary team of population health scientists. And we espouse the core values of kindness, transparency, and scientific rigor. So I'll talk a little bit about this project today, how it emerged, and some introduction to our work in this introduction. And then I'm going to turn to a section about our mission, which is to help people navigate the overwhelming amount of information flying during the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, I'll talk about some big lessons learned from having done this work over the past 15 months. So, sorry, I'm just arranging my window so I can see the chat. Thanks, Tom. I saw your question already. So I'll try and get to that question about what is curated data.
And you don't have to answer the questions in the chat as we go.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So a little bit about me. First of all, my name is Malia Jones. As you just heard, I have a PhD and a master's in public health. My training is really in epidemiology, community health specifically, and I also have some training in demography and geography. And so what I do is really truly interdisciplinary work, and it happens at the intersection of geography, where we spend time, and infectious disease. And so what that all means is I study how infectious diseases spread through groups of people. And in particular, I study how people who are vaccine hesitant can cluster in certain locations and undermine herd immunity. So I didn't really study previous to the pandemic new diseases. You know, we only reach herd immunity for diseases that have been around for a long time. But I was working in this adjacent space in infectious disease transmission. I could see that we had something big on the horizon in mid-February. I was actually on vacation in Iceland with my husband. And I was, checking my phone, watching cases go up in Italy, and I could see that we had a pandemic in our hands, and that things were going to get really tricky. At that time, I had truly no idea how tricky, and so this has really been a learning process for me. I was getting a lot of media inquiries early in March last year. And so I reached out to my longtime collaborator in the vaccine hesitancy space, Allison Buttenheim of Penn University, who is a behavioral scientist. Allison and I were at UCLA together and shared an advisor. And she and I together came up with this idea that we should, instead of trying to tackle everybody's really specific pandemic questions that they were sending us via email, mostly one at a time, that we should put them on social media somewhere public where we could answer them once and kind of consolidate our efforts. And that idea became Dear Pandemic. So a little bit of a timeline of what happened a little more than a year ago. February 23rd, which I was in Iceland at that time, the first US cases were confirmed. And just a few days later, Allison was asked to manage COVID inquiries coming in at Penn Nursing. On March 4th, just after I got back from Iceland, the CDC acknowledged person-to-person transmission happening in the United States for the first time. And this was really the moment that I knew that COVID-19 had arrived in the United States, and that we were about to be flooded with information and misinformation about the pandemic. The next morning was a Thursday. I woke up early and sent this email to my friends and family members. And it was really just a description of what I saw happening around me, what we might expect next, basic definitions like what is transmission, what is social distancing. It almost seems quaint to go back and read those suggestions, but the email really went viral, first in my email and then on social media. And the inquiries, my email address was on it. And so I started getting tons of inquiries in my personal email address, asking me questions, just, people I knew, people I didn't know, all kinds of strangers who had questions about what was going on around them. Ultimately, that email reached more than 10 million people on Facebook, I later learned. It was picked up as a op-ed in USA Today, where it was printed on the March 13th weekend edition, and read by more than 1 million more people there. So the next week, I was very overwhelmed. I reached out to Allison. Allison and I had this funny conversation where we were joking about how famous we are. And the next thing we knew, Dr. Oz was going to call us. And then it was the next day that Dr. Phil called me. And so the same day that Dear Pandemic launched, I was actually taping a Dr. Phil appearance. In which we were kind of talking about not vaccine myths, COVID-19 myths. At this time, there was really no good information out there about COVID-19. And so everyone was really kind of flying blind. And when Dear Pandemic stepped into that space, I think it was a very welcome thing to have a team of scientists who knew something about infectious disease, who were taking people's questions and trying to answer them from a scientific perspective. So that's a little bit about the origins. And before we move on to talking about the work that we do, I want to make a distinction for everyone, because I have found over the last year or so that there's a lot of misunderstanding about this issue. The difference between medicine and population health or public health. So public health refers to the study and practice of keeping groups of people healthy by doing things that affect everyone in the group. Things like improving water quality, making sure restaurants have to stay clean, making it harder to buy cigarettes, and making it a requirement for everyone to wear masks. And this is really quite different in a fundamental way from the study and practice of medicine, which is engaged with promoting health within a single individual person. And this is important because a pandemic is inherently a population problem, right? It is not an individual problem, but it requires individual level cooperation and individual level critical thinking about the behaviors that are going to keep us safe individually and keep us safe as a group. And this tension, I think, has really been one of the core problems of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. People are very challenged to think about things think about health in a population science perspective, because we're very used to thinking about health in a medicine perspective. So the Dear Pandemic team, we came together, as I just described, over the course of the first few weeks of the pandemic. Allison and I started reaching out to people we knew, especially people who were posting on social media and had some kind of an opinion or something to say about the pandemic. We ultimately grew to a team of 12 core doctorally trained contributors and an additional several other contributing writers and other types of contributors. We have a truly multidisciplinary team that covers just about every angle of relevant scientific expertise. We have clinicians and researchers, and our expertise includes epidemiology, gerontology, family medicine, mental health, economics, education, and many other fields. We also have at the core of our group one retired middle school teacher who is our operations person. She retired just as the pandemic last spring, just as the pandemic was closing schools, and this is her retirement gig. This is Gretchen Peterson right here in the middle of this picture, and she really holds our whole group together, so we really value her. What we do is we answer people's questions on social media about the pandemic and other topics. And we do this from a set of guiding principles. And so these guiding principles are that we take this interdisciplinary approach. We believe it takes more than just MDs to defeat a pandemic. In fact, it includes everyone, all of you who are listening today, and epidemiologists and MDs and everyone else. We also take a harm reduction approach, which is just the idea that a little bit better is a little bit better. We don't expect people to be perfect. We just expect people to do what they can. We think that the infodemic is as real as the pandemic, and I'm going to return to that word infodemic and talk about it quite a bit more. But in a nutshell, it's the idea that part of the problem is that we have too much information circulating about the pandemic. We also believe that policy and science are a partnership and that it is not a war between policy and science. And so we really advocate for science to be at the table in policy decisions. We believe in lifting up the voices of women in science. Our team is comprised entirely of women at this point, and it's part of our mission to lift up the voices of other women in science as well. And finally, we believe in the power of the personal connection. All of this started with a personal email that I wrote to my friends and family. And one of the things we've learned is that engaging successfully with people on social media really does mean you have to get personal and make a personal connection with those people in order to build trust and have them believe in that what you're saying is the truth. And I will return to that concept a little bit more later as well. So we do all of this by posting twice a day for the past, I should have looked, I think it's about 57 weeks and counting. We've been posting 2 times a day, answering people's questions about COVID-19 primarily on Facebook, but our Facebook posts are also disseminated to several other sites and our own website. We've posted over 1,000 questions and answers so far on social media. So Dear Pandemic does this. I've just got a few screenshots of our different social media sites. As I said, we are on Facebook primarily. We're also in Spanish on Facebook. We have a Spanish language mirror site called Querida Pandemia. And in addition to that, we are on Instagram and Twitter. I think we also have a presence now on LinkedIn, although that's outside my scope. I don't manage the LinkedIn account myself. So we've done all of this engagement, this back and forth with our readership, answering people's questions and soliciting those questions and finding answers. And I'm going to talk some now about the things that we have learned, and in particular about this idea of the infodemic. And so what we believe we've been really successful with is fighting the infodemic on its own turf. So the infodemic is the idea that there's too much information circulating. I find that, especially when it comes to vaccine hesitancy, people have a lot of questions. And as soon as we start to feel like those questions are being dismissed without honest answers, we all get very defensive. So the questions that people have, I think, are good. I'm a scientist and I love questions. Questions are what I do. The problem sometimes is the answers on social media. Some of the answers, the true answers are just complicated, and it's very hard to distill correct information from the mass of good and bad information that's flying on social media. And this is what leads to the infodemic. So the World Health Organization has identified this excess of information and called it an infodemic. And this is a quote from the World Health Organization where they say, an infodemic is an overabundance of information, both online and offline. Misinformation and disinformation can be harmful to people's physical and mental health, increase stigmatization, threaten precious health gains, and lead to poor observance of public health measures. The infodemic is particularly difficult because this pandemic is happening in the social media age. Social media is really primed to let information spread quickly, and it's actually more responsive to any information that's provocative. And so it doesn't respond to truth, it more reliably responds to just clickability. So early in the pandemic, there was a call, this was from Nature, there was a call for scientists to take up cudgels in the battle against bunk. And so we have really taken this as a call to action and has been our guiding principle for why we've stayed engaged in this work, trying to fight misinformation. The idea here is that we have to stop tolerating and legitimizing health pseudoscience, especially at universities and healthcare institutions, and that more researchers and scientists should become active participants in the public fight against misinformation. So this is one of the reasons that we are engaged directly on social media, where people are already getting their disinformation and misinformation. I talk a lot about this idea of the power of the share button. As I started to discuss just a minute ago, information really flies on social media, and those algorithms respond better to the altitude of flight than to anything about its quality. And because we trust our friends and the people in our social networks, we tend to believe the things that they share with us. And one of the things that we've learned is that, in fact, we trust messages that come from people we know even more than messages that come from experts. And so these one-on-one conversations that we have and the stories that we share with our loved ones are really very influential. And so it's very important for each of us to be mindful about where our information is coming from and where it's going when we share it. In addition to that, I'll say I think we should never underestimate the power of a personal conversation to change minds. I used to be a little pessimistic about this, but I have now seen dozens of examples of where someone claimed to be completely against getting vaccinated or some other public health measure, and a simple conversation revealed some pretty fundamental questions that once they had answers, people's behavior changed. And so I really think there's a lot of power in having those hard conversations one-to-one. So we're seeing these disinformation campaigns happening around COVID-19 on social media. And so I want to tease out the difference between misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation is simply information that's incorrect or out of context, but disinformation is intentionally developed and intended to deceive us. We have found that a recent report by the Center for Digital Hate found that most of the bad information that goes around on social media about COVID-19 vaccines specifically is generated by just 12 individuals. And they titled these the Disinformation Dozen. So we're seeing these really intentional efforts to manipulate our emotions and manipulate the information landscape about COVID-19. And when we hit that share button, those disinformation sources become misinformation. And it's the power of the share button. That's really the engine that drives misinformation. So what we know about this is that whether a message is received well is all about the messenger. It actually has very little to do with the content. And as I said, because we trust our friends and the people in our social networks, we tend to believe them, and often even more than experts. It's really so it's really important for us to manage the information that we share well. And I've added these slides for this talk. This had to be cut from the broadcast version of this talk because I'm not allowed to say bullshit on broadcast, but I'm allowed to say it here. So if this is something that interests you, I want to really recommend this recent book from Carl T. Bergstrom and Jevin D. West, two professors at the other UW in Washington. And it's a popular press book that is about how to detect and deal with nonsense, especially on social media. And they lay out this these rules for how to detect bullshit. And their three simple rules are to just ask yourself these simple questions. When you read something on social media or elsewhere, you can ask, who is telling me this? How do they know it? And what are they trying to sell me? And actually, if we apply these 3 simple rules to a lot of the misinformation about COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccines, it turns out to be a very effective way to parse the good from the bad information. When you found some bad information on social media, we have some tips for how to deal with it. And we did a post on this way back in September. These 3 tips also come from the book by Bergstrom and West, but we've kind of repackaged them for the Dear Pandemic audience here. And these 3 simple steps are to first be kind. None of us likes to be called out on bad information, and so it goes a long way to just be nice about it. Second, to be correct. And it's really notable here that conspiracy theories and false information resonate with us all to some extent. The conspiracy theory expert, Dr. Rob Brotherton, says to us that conspiracy theories and belief in conspiracy theories are a defense mechanism. We are primed to be suspicious and afraid by our own psychology of things that can't be explained. And so we're really attracted to things that explain the unexplained. No one is above conspiracy theories, even you and me. And so it's very important when we wade into the battle against misinformation that we be correct and check our own facts so we're not spreading additional misinformation. And then the third tip is to focus on the facts, not on the fictions. If you argue too hard with the specifics of any conspiracy theory or other misinformation, it's really easy to end up in the weeds. And so one of the takeaways from best practices for how to engage in this work is to just focus on what's true and don't try too hard to debunk the individual specifics of the things that are not true. I will say one of the tactics that I've found very successful is to look at some of the myths that are flying around and try to find the little nugget of truth that is part of their origin. And so we can apply these tactics and just take a look at a couple of the vaccine myths that are flying around out here. And I've picked a couple here for you. So here's the first one. There's a myth that vaccines cause infertility or problems with pregnancy. The truth is that vaccines, like all new drugs, are not tested on pregnant people for ethical reasons. However, the American Academy of Obstetrics and Gynecology and every other national organization that serves pregnant people strongly recommends vaccines for anyone who is pregnant. And that's because one of the major risk factors for poor COVID-19 outcomes is pregnancy. In addition, many thousands of people have successfully become pregnant after vaccination at this point, and there have been really no red flags. So you can kind of look at the myth that vaccines cause infertility and find that one little nugget of truth as a starting point to start talking about the bigger picture of where this myth came from, who was disseminating the myth, how they know, and what they're trying to sell you. In this case, I was not able to figure out who was spreading the rumor. It seems one of the really targeted disinformation campaigns. And actually the myth that vaccines cause infertility has come up at least twice before with different vaccines. There was a major boycott of the polio vaccine in Nigeria in 2003 after this myth went around. And it's also one that comes up a lot with HPV vaccination. So it's kind of an old one that has been trotted out again with COVID-19 vaccines. Here's another one. There's a myth that has been flying around. This is a persistent one, that the vaccines only last 90 days. The truth underlying this myth is that the CDC offered, just after the Biden administration took charge, they offered some unfortunate messaging that led to this rumor. It was kind of just framed badly. What we don't know how long vaccines will protect us, but we do know that it's much longer than 90 days. At this point, it's at least 6 months and probably much longer than that. And once again, you can look at who is spreading this information and what they hope to gain by it. And that can often be a helpful starting point to try and disentangle what's true from what is not. The next one that I want to highlight is that vaccines don't protect you or anyone else. The truth of this myth is, yes, they definitely do. There have been a handful of breakthrough cases of COVID after someone has been vaccinated. It's about 6,000 breakthrough cases in nearly 2 million doses of vaccine given. So it's incredibly unusual. The truth is no vaccine is 100% effective, but these vaccines that we have for COVID-19 come about as close as you might expect. Here's one more. The myth is that vaccines contain microchips. The truth is that no, they don't contain microchips. This myth seems to have come from some research that's in development where there actually is a vaccine record microchip technology. It's not yet in any vaccine. And we saw early on in the pandemic, there was a video that went viral where some footage of Bill and Melinda Gates were talking about that, and some different parts of that conversation were spliced together in a way that made it sound like they were saying that the vaccines for COVID-19 actually contain microchips. So I thought that was a very interesting little nugget of truth. That video was produced by a well-known disinformation producer who is in the business of selling vitamin D supplements. Here's another one. The myth that's going around is that the J&J vaccine contains aborted fetuses. This is not true. The truth is that the J&J vaccine, one of the components of the vaccine, the viral delivery mechanism, is grown in a fetal cell line. But a fetal cell line, as all the biologists here will know, is not the same as an aborted fetus. And this myth seems to be propagated mostly by people in the religious right who would like to make the vaccine development process part of the conversation about abortions. I'm going to skip these next two that I threw in here in the interest of time. And so what can we do about this? When we are on social media and we see rumors flying, I have some tips for how to both detect misinformation and also deal with it. The first tip is to check your own emotional response. Disinformation is designed specifically to provoke an emotional response. And so if you find yourself thinking, whoa, that is really scary, then that's a red flag that, you know, some things are real and they are really, really scary. And if you're reading some headlines and they seem designed to scare you, then that's just something to notice and maybe dig a little deeper before you hit the share button. The second tip is to check your source and specifically make sure that it's from a credible news organization or a scientist that you trust. There are a lot of people out there who are posing as credible news organizations to spread bad information. Go beyond the headlines. Headlines are usually written by an editor in order to produce the most engagement and sometimes don't even really represent what's in the article. So it is really important to read beyond the headlines when we're browsing social media news. The next tip is to identify the author. If you can identify the author and assess whether or not they're widely trusted in the journalism or scientific community, that can go a long way. Check the date. This is a really easy trap to fall into, and we're still kind of playing whack-a-mole with some rumors that were flying around over a year ago when the COVID-19 pandemic first came out, and really we didn't have any good information. Checking the date is a simple way to figure out if information could be out of date. The next tip is to check your own biases. I have often found myself primed to agree with something that I that goes along with my existing beliefs, right? And we're less inclined to believe something when it challenges our beliefs. And so when something is really just checking off all of my own biases and all of my own boxes, then that is another red flag to me that I need to dig a little deeper and make sure that what I'm reading is really true. And finally, turn to fact checkers. This is a really simple step for anyone who's trying to assess the quality of something that they're reading on social media. It can go a long way to just put the headline of what you're reading into the Google search bar, followed by the words fact check. That can often lead you to some great fact checkers who do this as a public service or a paid service. So one of the things that Dear Pandemic really tries to do is to replace bad information with good information and flood the information landscape with good information. And so we take these questions and these myths about COVID-19 and the COVID-19 vaccines and try to inject some well-vetted, curated information into the social media information marketplace. So here are a few examples. The first was about whether the vaccines can change our DNA. The second one is about ivermectin, which this debate has died down in the United States, but is still very much raging in the rest of the world. And then the third one is back last October, there was a CDC study that some disinformation purveyors claimed showed that wearing masks is bad for us. So what we're really trying to do is twofold. One of our goals is to be present in the social media landscape, offering good information. And the second, and that means we're fighting misinformation directly by equipping our readers with that share button. So when they share our information, it's out there competing with the disinformation. The second thing we want to do, though, is equip our readers to be more savvy consumers of information and build critical thinking skills about how science itself works. And so we do this with a series of posts that are about the scientific process and how to evaluate the information that we're receiving. So here are a few examples of that. This is a post called How Do I Fight Fake News? The second is an explanation of how the scientific process is really dependent on evolving thinking and change. And then here's another example where we posted about how to tell if reporting is high quality reporting. So let's turn to what we've learned about COVID-19 over these past 15, 16 months. And I think everyone here probably has a basic understanding of what COVID-19 is, but just to get everyone on the same page, COVID-19 is a new virus to human beings. It emerged late in 2019 and became pandemic by March. It spreads from person to person, usually through the air. The COVID-19 infection, it's a viral infection which can be fatal. It affects us by getting into our lungs and sometimes affecting our other organs. And it's affected tens of millions of people all around the world. At this time in the United States, we are nearly to, I think we've just passed 600,000 recorded deaths. And there was a recent report that analyzed excess deaths in the United States and found that we're actually closer to 1 million if you look at it from an excess deaths perspective. And then, of course, it's upended every aspect of our social, emotional, financial, and every other domain of life as we've tried to deal with all of the unrest and all of the disruption of the pandemic. So I've been here on social media talking about, trying to provide really practical answers to people's everyday living in a pandemic questions. And one of the things that I have noticed is that we have a very limited ability to think about and understand risk. And so I want to talk a little bit about what risk is before we wrap up here. One is how likely, so what is risk? Risk is just the possibility of something bad happening. And when we start to think about risk, we also start to think about probabilities, right? How likely is that bad outcome? And what can we do to manipulate it? What makes it more or less likely? So what can we do to influence how likely the bad outcome is? We get a ton of questions at Dear Pandemic that are phrased something like, here's my very specific situation. Is it safe? Right? And one of the things that I think we really need to work on is the idea that, you know, nothing is black and white in this world. Safety is not an off switch, it's a continuum. We can't make living in a pandemic safe. It's an inherently unsafe situation, but we can do things to make it safer. And so I really want to encourage people to think about risk as being not an on-off switch. Instead, we need to think about risk being on a spectrum and how to improve our chances by doing the little things that we can to make things safer. The other thing about risk that I find is still really challenging for people to wrap their heads around is that there are several different kinds of risk in a pandemic. The first, and I want to just disentangle these from one another, because when they get mixed up is when we really get in trouble and things get confusing. So the first is that the risk that you'll be near someone who has COVID-19, right? This is your risk of exposure. And often this is a modifiable risk. These are the reasons, you know, trying to reduce the risk that any of us will be near someone with COVID-19 is why public health recommends to stay at home, avoid large and small gatherings, and all the focus on reducing the number of cases community-wide. The next type of risk is that if you do happen to be near someone who has COVID-19, that you'll catch it from them, right? So not everyone who's exposed to COVID-19 ends up getting it. It's a probability, it's not a guarantee. And again, these are modifiable. The things that we do to modify this risk are to wear a mask, reduce the, stay as far physically away from other people as we can so that we're not sharing air with them, keep our interactions brief, and improve the ventilation so that the volume of shared air is lower. The next type of risk is that if I were to catch COVID-19, the risk that I would give it to another person. This is the risk of onward transmission. And again, these are pretty modifiable risks. And we use the exact same strategies to prevent catching COVID-19 as we do to prevent transmission. So wearing a mask, physical distancing, shorter interactions, and improving ventilation. And then finally, we get to the risk that most people are thinking of when we talk about risk of COVID-19. And that's the risk that if you catch COVID-19, that you'll be hospitalized or die of it. This is the only one of the types of risk that is really not very modifiable. And that's because the things that lead us to be high risk for poor outcomes or hospitalization and death are things we can't control. And those are our age, living in crowded settings like nursing homes or dormitories or prisons and jails. People who are Black or Native race are at higher risk for hospitalization or death for a variety of structural reasons. There's a whole list of medical conditions, including obesity, diabetes, and chronic lung conditions that put us at higher risk. And then there are other conditions like pregnancy, high body weight, and smoking. And for most of these, there's really not much we can control about our risk of hospitalization and death. So what can we do to make living in a pandemic safer? These are the evidence-based tips that we have been promoting at Dear Pandemic. We came up with these last summer, about a year ago, and it's really amazing how well they've held up over all of the changes that we've had over the past year. We used an acronym to talk about these strategies to make living in a pandemic safer. and the acronym is SMART. So they are to, S is for space, keep our distance, stay at least 6 feet away from anyone outside our households, wear a mask, keep it on, a cloth face covering protects everyone. Air, A is for air. The idea here is to keep the air as fresh as possible, outside being best, or a well-ventilated room if you can't be outside. The R is for restrict. This is the idea that we should keep our contacts to as few people as we can, so that the contact patterns we have don't lead to a lot of onward transmission in the community. And then finally, the T is for time. It turns out that the less time we spend with sharing air with people out from outside our households, the lower our risk of catching COVID becomes. So this is sort of our organizing framework for how we can make things a little bit safer in a pandemic. And one other thing to note here is that, I said at the beginning that we take a harm reduction approach. We think about this in terms of the Swiss cheese model of disease prevention. Any one of these strategies has some holes in it all by itself, but when you layer several of them together, it becomes harder for any of the virus to get through to us. And then finally, over the last 6 months, there's one more thing that we can do in order to protect ourselves and our communities, and that's get vaccinated. The vaccines that we have available for COVID-19, there are 3 so far, and probably at least one more coming soon. 2 of them use a technology called a mRNA vaccine, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine uses a little bit of viral vector delivery system instead. And just today, I'm so excited to talk about the fact that the CDC recommended the Pfizer vaccine for a new age group for 12 to 15-year-olds. If you had asked me, and actually a lot of people did ask me this time last year, how long it was going to take to get vaccines to market, I would have never predicted, even with the help of my handy 8-ball, that we would have nearly 50% of people in the United States vaccinated with at least 1 dose and have really effective, really safe vaccines available for everyone who is at least 12 years old. So, this has been, of all of the losses of this year, the big win has been scientists who came to the rescue with the COVID-19 vaccines on an incredible timeline and incredibly successful. Right now, vaccine rollout is still fairly limited by supply constraints and logistical challenges of getting the vaccine to certain communities, but increasingly we're seeing that vaccine uptake is hampered by hesitancy about vaccination. And this really brings us full circle to what I was talking about the last time I was at Wednesday night at the lab, which is vaccine hesitancy. So before we turn to that, I'll just return to this idea of the hierarchy of risks. What is so exciting about the vaccines is that this is the only strategy we have that can take our risks of being hospitalized or dying if we catch COVID-19 from not very modifiable to a modifiable risk. It also, actually, getting vaccinated helps us reduce the risks that we'll transmit it to someone else, and the risk that if we're near someone with COVID-19, that we'll catch it with them. And ultimately, when we are, as vaccine uptake grows through our community, all of those immune people will contribute to lower risk that any of us will be near someone who has COVID-19. So they're really our best shot, so to speak, at ending the pandemic for good. In order to do that, ultimately, I just wrote an essay that's going to appear in Slate about this idea of herd immunity. It'll be out tomorrow, and it's really talking about what is herd immunity and how is it different. How is it different from the end of the pandemic? I think there's been a lot of fairly simplistic understanding of what the herd immunity goal looks like and how that is ultimately going to play into the end of the pandemic. I think that here in the United States, we're already seeing enough vaccine coverage that we have the most vulnerable people largely protected, and transmission chains are being cut off. We're seeing much lower cases across the United States today than we were even 6 weeks ago. And so we are already starting to see vaccines contribute to less community transmission. Ultimately, when there's very little transmission of disease happening in the United States and we have very good coverage of the vaccines, that's when we'll reach herd immunity. So herd immunity is often understood as kind of a finish line, but it's actually, it's not a finish line. It's sort of the state where we maintain, you know, a community that has low COVID-19 risk. Herd immunity is not the same at all as individual level protection. And in order to understand this, I think we have to ask protection from what? So when we think about individual level protection, being vaccinated personally provides me with protection from the disease, but having a lot of people vaccinated provides all of us, including those who can't be vaccinated because they're allergic or they're too young, from an outbreak of COVID-19. And so really the difference between individual immunity and herd immunity is that population individual thing that I was talking about at the very beginning. So how do we reach herd immunity for COVID-19? Well, simply put, a lot of people need to be immune to the disease, and we have to have very low numbers of cases circulating in the community. It is a real challenge that the global vaccine situation is really very uneven. I think before we can declare the pandemic ended and look at something, we may get to herd immunity here in the United States and other high-income nations, but before the pandemic will be declared ended, we will likely, it will likely be years because of the low vaccine supply in the rest of the world. So this is something that is going to be the topic of my future research, probably for many years to come. One of the big questions here is how many people need to be vaccinated. There's a crude way to figure out how many people we need to reach herd immunity. And then there's the more exact way. The crude way suggests that it's something like 70 or 80% of the population. But the more exact calculation is more or less impossible to do in a future looking way. You can really only figure it out after the fact. And that's because it's really, really sensitive to small changes in behavior, like how many people are riding buses each day and what kind and whether people are wearing masks. It's also very sensitive to adaptations of the virus itself. And so as the virus, you know, circulates around the world and infects millions and millions of people, it adapts. And if it finds an advantageous adaptation, then the herd immunity threshold can change significantly. So we don't know what the exact threshold is, and it'll be a big topic of my research to try and figure it out, probably for years to come. So finally, returning to this idea of vaccine hesitancy, people who don't want to get the COVID-19 remain a serious threat to public health. And I personally think this is the largest barrier to ending the pandemic for good. A little bit about vaccine hesitancy itself, though. You know, vaccine hesitancy is not the same thing as being an anti-vaxxer. Vaccine hesitancy is a spectrum. People have a whole range of different ideas about why they might not want to get the vaccines. And often those ideas are something like, I'm interested, but not yet. And I think we really do need to allow space for those people who want to wait a little bit longer, and you know, just be steady and encouraging and keep looking at the really stellar data that are coming out of the vaccine studies in terms of safety and effectiveness. We also know that vaccine attitudes evolve over time. So people do change their minds about vaccines all the time. And people get their information about vaccines from a lot of sources, not just their clinician. And those include social media and their friends and family. So if you're listening to me right now, that's you. So I would encourage you to talk with your loved ones about and ask genuine questions about what their vaccine concerns are. So what have we learned for looking forward to the next pandemic? I think that we have a real opportunity to improve trust in science. We also need to improve scientific literacy in the general population. I think that the infodemic problem is not going anywhere. You know, we live in a social media age and that is not going to end. So there's a lot of work to be done to figure out how to deal with that and how to fight an infodemic in parallel to the pandemic. I think that we should not underestimate our own power to influence, especially through personal conversations. And as I was saying, through the power of the share button. And then in terms of to big takeaways from a science communication perspective, the one thing that I have learned here is that you just cannot be too practical when it comes to scientific communications. So, you know, I think one of the things Dear Pandemic has really succeeded at is giving practical advice about how to make daily decisions and not general advice. So, you know, it's one thing to tell people everyone should wear a mask, and it's another thing to be the person who is, you know, sitting in front of your computer at 11 p.m. trying to figure out exactly which mask to order for your child who's going to school tomorrow. There are a lot of individual little practical decisions that go into each of these behaviors. And so we really need to improve our ability to talk with the public and give practical, specific advice. So what's next for Dear Pandemic? The truth is I have no idea. I'm hoping that the salience of being a science communicator in the pandemic is going to end someday. I couldn't tell you exactly when that will be, and I couldn't tell you what Dear Pandemic will become after that happens, but the team of collaborators is really committed to staying engaged with science communication, and we're actually working on a couple of grant proposals right now to try and pivot what we're doing to train other scientists in how to do science communication better, and also study how we might all do better science communication. So I will leave you with where to learn more. Here are all of our different ways to get our information, and I'm delighted to take some questions from our participants tonight.
Thank you very much, Malia. I think there's a series of questions in the chat, and if Bia can help us with those, that'd be great. Bia, do you want to lead off with one, and then we can prime the pump? And then if people want to speak their question, they can do that also.
Excuse me, sorry. There are quite a few just kind of comments put in there. But I think the first question I'm seeing is from Larry, and he says, how does one respond EUR versus approval by FDA?
Yeah, so this is a question that we are getting quite a bit at Dear Pandemic. The COVID-19 vaccines right now have emergency use authorization from the FDA, which is a little bit different from FDA approval. And the way that I respond to those questions is to explain what emergency use authorization is. EUA and full FDA approval actually have a lot in common. They both require the same clinical trial process phase. They both require the same number of trial participants. They're both reviewed by a series of independent experts. And the difference is that the emergency use authorization is given much more rapidly than full authorization is. And so, you know, I like to talk about it as kind of being the express lane to having a temporary approval, while the full FDA approval is in process. And actually Pfizer did just submit for full approval, and we expect that to be coming through fairly soon too.
Others? Would somebody like to speak a spoken question?
I have a question. I am a believer in vaccination. My whole family has been vaccinated. But I have to make this comment. Ever since we found out the first patient having COVID in the United States, we have been receiving conflicting recommendations. And it started with WHO saying that there is no people-to-people transmission. And to some extent, even our experts started saying that. And our initial recommendation was there is no need for masks. And so the whole approach of the experts, I agree, they were not sure how the whole virus behaves. But I wish they had also added a caveat saying that the recommendation we are making today is tentative. We are still awaiting firm conclusion. But till then, our recommendation is to do this. And so we have seen over a period of 3 months or so, the recommendations have been time varying. In other words,
Yeah.
first, and so that's very unfortunate. I feel that has been a major contributor to vaccine hesitancy, and it's very unfortunate. And what happened, even the politicians of the opposing party, they started saying, if the vaccine comes from the previous administration, we are not going to take it because we are not sure about the potency of the vaccine. So
Yeah, it is. So it is really a challenge. The one of the things I think we can take away from this pandemic in terms of communications and risk communications in general is that the general public does not understand at all this idea that no one has the answer, right? And that the scientific process is not a fixed set of facts. It's an evolving, moving target. And so, you know, we still struggle with this during pandemic. We get people who, for example, when the CDC just released their updated guidance for fully vaccinated people, we got a million questions about, well, what does this mean for kids? Are kids exempt from this? And that stems from a failure to understand that those are, you know, interim guidelines, and that they'll be updated again when kids become vaccinated and are eligible to be vaccinated. So I'd say that, you know, I think you've identified a really important gap in terms of both scientific communication and scientific literacy. People just don't understand that things are changing, and especially back, you know, last April, no one had a clue. No one knew any real answers. And so that's where some of the misinformation was coming from. There was just a vacuum of information. I see a question in the chat from Laura. Can we take this one about hesitancy and in the BIPOC community?
Sure.
Yeah, so Laura says there's a lot of hesitancy in the Black and Hispanic communities. I think we need to work with those communities to alleviate the fear of history will be repeated by experimenting on them. So this is really interesting, Laura. It's a great question. There is hesitancy in the Black and Hispanic and other BIPOC communities, but it turns out that the number of people who are hesitant about the vaccine among Black and Hispanic people is dwarfed by the hesitancy among rural whites. By far the largest group, the largest contributor to vaccine hesitancy is evangelical white Christians in the United States. And so while I totally agree with you that working with those BIPOC communities is very important, I think there's a real need to work with rural and evangelical whites as well. We will never get to herd immunity without addressing that problem.
Do you think that's actually realistically achievable? Those communities are extraordinarily resistant to just about everything.
I don't know. You want me to ask my 8-ball? Let's find out. What it says.
Absolutely.
It says, as I see it, yes. So,
Let's
so
hear it.
I have a couple of ongoing projects that both of them just started that are set out to try and redeploy the Dear Pandemic model and just be open to questions from those communities. And I'm actually proposing a third project like this that specifically targets religious leaders and is hopefully going to help religious leaders, one, recover from the incredible burnout that they're facing, having been community leaders through this whole mess, and two, create space for some of the questions that people just need answers to about the COVID-19 vaccines in order to move forward with them. So yeah, I think that really remains to be seen.
Other
But we're
questions?
trying.
Bea, do we have any others queued up in the chat?
I don't see any, but I was actually kicked out of the Zoom earlier, so I don't know if there's anything before Sandy
Okay.
Rodder's link.
All right. Could you go back to that when I was interested to use the word curated right at the beginning of your talk. Can you talk more about what that means and doesn't mean?
Yeah, so what I was referring to when I use the word curated is the idea that here we are in a Walmart of information on social media, and how do you know what the good products are without investing tons of time and energy on your own into reviewing them all? And so what we're doing at Dear Pandemic is we've got this team of experts, and we are engaged in taking people's questions and then trying to provide them with what we think is the best scientifically grounded evidence in the moment. And so we're kind of doing the we're doing this curation in order to provide people with good information that they can feel comfortable sharing without having to research it all themselves. And we actually hear from some of our readers sometimes when they say things like, you're such a great resource for me. I'm a biologist and I was going crazy trying to answer all my family's COVID questions until I found your site. So I think this really is a service that we're providing even to other scientists. And that I hope we can continue providing.
So what I'm hearing is that unlike in libraries where you curate the good and the bad, the curating means to preserve and catalog and preserve over time, whether it's good or bad. The way that you view curation, which is fine because there's a lot of definitions, is that you're doing some of the sifting and winnowing, and here's the higher quality stuff, so that people don't have to do that distillation or sifting themselves.
Yes, yeah, that's the kind of curation that I was referring to, rather than actually archiving the good and the bad. We got an inquiry from the Library of Congress, who is doing some of your kind of curation of COVID-19 information and the information landscape, and it was very interesting to hear what their plans are for that's curating.
From a historical point of view, capturing all the flotsam and jetsam as well as the jewels, and it's going to be an amazing thing. I just can't imagine what historians 50 years from now are going to do. It's probably like us looking at 1918, 1919 flu epidemic and just scratching our heads about, wow.
So I hope someone writes a great book about it. I actually read The Great Influenza, which is one of the popular press books about the 1919 influenza pandemic. And during this pandemic, it's one of the books that I read. And it's truly disturbing how many of the lessons we should have learned in that pandemic we repeated.
I'm a big fan of this book called Only Yesterday, which came out in 1932, but it was a retelling of history from 1918 right up to 1929. So the end of World War I through the crash in October of 29. And I love the book, but boy, there isn't much in there about influenza and how pervasive it was.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I think one of the great things for us compared to 101 years ago is we don't have to make that decision about how much we're going to remember about our pandemic versus how much we're going to remember about a horrific world war. So, you mentioned changes over the last 14 years. Could you give us an idea of what you see as from February, March of last year to May of today? What one or two or three biggest changes are from your point of view, what we thought then, what we know now?
Oh my.
Well, we'll cut it
So
off at 9 o'clock.
yeah, that's a big question. I mean, what hasn't changed? Going into this, I had a very unrealistic set of expectations about what the United States was prepared to do to deal with the pandemic, and what frankly what individual people would do in order to protect themselves and the people around them. I didn't see so many of the things coming. Probably the biggest surprise, I guess, is the surprise is not exactly the right word, but the shock / surprise to me was the whole we can achieve herd immunity through just letting everyone get sick argument that came out of the libertarian movement, and was
Secretary
really
of Health.
Sorry?
And the Secretary of Health.
And the Secretary of Health, who was part of that movement. That as someone who studies herd immunity, it was just, I mean, it was almost so nonsensical that it was hard to argue with, because there was just no, you couldn't get any purchase on it. That's completely not what herd immunity is, or how it works, or how it has ever been achieved, or anything. And so that was probably the biggest one for me in terms of like, what? What are we talking about right now? And, it was also really surprising to me to see how many people we lost. I expected the United States to be able to respond to this quickly and effectively. And instead we have one of the highest death rates in the world from the pandemic. And it's been a real disappointment. It's really, I mean, truly, it's shaken my ideas about the whole project of public health and how we understand human behavior, truly.
And the social contract.
Yeah. And I studied the social contract. I study herd immunity, right?
Yeah.
That's the idea that we get vaccinated for other people. And I just didn't see it coming.
I have a comment about what I thought was most surprising. It's still happening today, is that people are creating numbers and statistics basically to prove that it doesn't exist, or it's minor, et cetera. It's like it's manipulating numbers and percentages, et cetera, to minimize, and they basically ignore how many people died. And that's kind of surprising as part of the disinformation, that people have no clue what numbers are and how they work.
Yeah, and I think you're alluding to this very persistent notion that it's 99% survivable, right? That's the way it's often framed. COVID is 99% survivable. Why should I, whatever it is, stay home, change my behaviors, miss Thanksgiving with grandma? And I think this is in part a challenge with numeracy. As you say, some people just don't understand what 99% is. Truly, it's a percent, and percents are hard. That's some fairly advanced math. And so I actually saw this in the chat. Nancy said that it's hard to understand the per 1,000 or per 100,000 rates as well. This is a similar problem. And so whenever I talk about numbers like this, I really try and put it in terms of individual people. And so when somebody wants to talk to me about COVID is 99% survivable, then I try and talk about, well, which one of the 100 people you know are you willing to part with?
It's a
Or
good
would you
question
get
to
on
ask
an
of,
airplane that seats 100 people, knowing that one of you is going to be, shoved out the emergency exit
since there happen to be 100 members of the U.S. Senate, that seems to be a good question to ask of at least 2 senators.
Yeah. So the other way to deal with that, that I don't know if this way is successful or not, but the real problem with 99% survivable is that, 1% of everyone in the world is a whole lot of people. And so when you start to add up how many people that really is, you get to a very big number very quickly. The challenge there is that humans don't understand big numbers very well and don't connect with them very well. And so I don't really know how successful that tactic is to say, like, oh, okay, well, 1% of everyone in the United States. Well, that's quite a few people.
I have a question on sources for information. I am not, for instance, on Facebook. And so I did not know about your lovely project. I think you're doing wonderful work here. One of my sources has been to go to the CDC website. And one of my problems with the CDC website is even if I go back the same day, it's often hard to find the same page.
Oh, yeah.
Which means if I want to cite something to somebody else, I don't have an easy way to get to that same reference.
Right.
Is there any consideration being done to alter how they build that website in particular, but other places where that similar major governmental or authoritarian, reliable sources are actually writing their websites to make them more user-friendly by the ordinary person?
So there's this little teeny niche of science called plain language communication, plain language writing. And plain language is really the idea that, you have to meet your audience where they are. And it involves a lot of things like user testing to identify readability and navigability of a website. And plain language is a science that really needs to be brought up and brought into the mainstream. And I would love it if the CDC website had a plain language communication expert. I don't think they do. Plain language summaries of clinical trial results are very recently going to be required in the EU. And I think that idea that we could have a plain language version of clinical trial results, or an informed consent agreement, has tremendous power and potential to alleviate some of the vaccine hesitancy. I mean, I'm sure many of you in this call got vaccinated, and that handout that they gave you when you got vaccinated, the very first thing it says on there is, this is an experimental drug, right? With no explanation of what that means or what's important about it or anything. And I saw that and was just like, oh man, could we just get a better communication device than this thing? Somebody could rewrite this. It's important to know that it's an experimental drug. It's not the most important thing to know about the COVID vaccine you just got, right? So yeah, I think that's a great idea. I also will say that, the CDC and the Department of Health Services and even the county Department of Public Health, they're very restricted in how much, personal they can be in their communications and how practical. And so I think there's a place in the world for things like Dear Pandemic to be offering something different than what CDC is offering. And since you're not on social media, I would encourage you to check out our website and our email newsletter, because
I
those will
certainly
come.
will do so.
Yeah, because those will come directly to you. There are a number of similar things out there to us. And, you know, I'm really interested in this idea that there can be non-government support systems for these communication needs.
Malia, I'd like to second that. I think one of the things that we haven't talked about tonight was the whole dispute from the Trump administration over the science of COVID and people being muffled or muzzled. And I think for people like you and me who work at universities, especially public universities, especially public land grant universities, this is one of our big things, is to be able to speak in plain language on behalf of the people, and speak truth to power, to use that phrase. And it's one of the things I like most about being here at a university. And I hope that's something that we can continue to do. Cooperative Extension has been doing this since 1912 or even earlier. You know, at the Applied Population Lab, that's what you and your colleagues are trying to do. I just want to second what you just said about how important it is for not only non-government organizations, but public universities to have the freedom and the courage to speak up and speak out. Other questions?
Yeah, there's another one in the chat. Kathleen asks, how does one tell a good source from a bad one? Just because a publication's name is well known doesn't mean they're reliable. Also, the same question for an author.
Yeah, so great question, Kathleen. And I think those tips that I offered, you know, somewhere around the middle of my talk about what we call information hygiene during pandemic might be helpful here. And those are to just ask yourself some questions about who is telling you this information, how they know it, you know, what are their sources, and what's their motivation. And that third one is the one that I'm always trying to dig deeper into and try to understand what is the motivation, in particular of the producers of vaccine disinformation. And in many cases, I don't have that puzzled out. I don't know exactly. Some cases it's really obvious. I mean, a couple of them genuinely they sell vitamins, and that is their motivation. It's pretty clear. Others, it's really not clear, and I'm still trying to puzzle out what motivates some of the producers of bad information. But in general, I think those are great tips to try and assess whether information is good or bad. You know, who's telling it to you, how do they know it, and are they trying to sell you something? And in the case of journalism, sometimes what they're trying to sell you is their own reputation. And so if it's really clickbaity, or if it's really provoking, then that might be a reason to think twice about the source, and think a little bit more critically about why they might be selling you that particular package of information. You know, we all have biases. I don't claim to be an unbiased source ever, because I'm a human being, and we all come to the table with biases. But I'm motivated by the project of public health, which is to try and keep everyone safe in a pandemic. So not everyone is motivated by that.
Other questions? I think we got everything. Sandy asked, Leah, can you speak to the interdisciplinary nature of public health, science of team science?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, my work is really truly very interdisciplinary, and has been for a long time. And I'm my day job is at the Applied Population Laboratory at UW-Madison, which is an interdisciplinary applied demography laboratory. And I really love working in that kind of interdisciplinary environment and, working with people who have a different perspective on the same research questions, right? And so I think that there's a lot to be gained by taking in the views of many disciplines. And that has never been more clear to me than it has been in my work with Dear Pandemic. Our contributing team is incredibly interdisciplinary, and I learn things from them every day. I mean, I've learned more in the last year. I could get another PhD in all the things that I've learned in the last year. And there are things that I bring to the table, and I'm very often learning something new from the rest of the contributing team. And in particular, we have a team of 3 nurse practitioners, and they especially have brought me so much in terms of changed perspective on how I think about the world. I come to things from a very population sciences kind of perspective, and nurses come to the table from a very one-on-one kind of a perspective. And it's really interesting to see where those things come together. So you asked about the science of team science. I don't know anything about the science of team science, but I know I'm engaged in this work. And so my point of view on it is it's worth the trouble.
It's a pretty amazing thing just going to the Dear Pandemic website and going through who's on the team and seeing the range of experience and expertise and points.
It's an awesome team.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, I'm thinking of in terms of weave and weft and all this stuff, there's very tight. Yeah.
I once attempted to list all of our various areas of expertise, and I eventually had to give up. It was just too long.
Yeah.
People kept adding more, and I was like, oh my God,
How do we do that?
Too bad we don't have any information around here.
I was interested when you were talking about infodemic, you emphasized several times that in an infodemic, from where you were coming from, at least what I was hearing was it's too much information. And when I looked up the World Health Organization, they right away said misinformation and wrong information. And you did not emphasize that. And I was picking up on that because, well, I'm guessing you think that too much information is about as problematic as misinformation.
I think it is just as problematic as just misinformation, because if we have too much information, then we give up.
Yeah.
And we end up in the same situation as if we had no information at all, because there's, in addition to lots of information, we need a way to parse it. We need a way to decide which is the, of all the choices I have, which is the one that I'm going to go with. And what we see when we get questions from people who read Dear Pandemic is that feeling of just being overwhelmed and not knowing what to do is really producing a lot of mental health challenges for people. I mean, it's really, it's produced a ton of anxiety, and this term that we talk about sometimes called acedia. Acedia is a word for that feeling where you are bored and on edge at the same time. And so having too much information, I think is almost just as bad as having none.
Both those things are new ideas to me. I haven't heard that before. Acedia.
We have a great post about acedia. If you look, it's here, I'll find it and put it in the chat. Acedia. It's spelled ACEDIA.
What's it come from etymologically?
I have no idea.
Good, I get to look something up. Yay. Anybody else?
I have a question for Malia, if I may.
Sure, Raj, go ahead.
Malia, I was wondering, in your talk, you said you were getting thousands and thousands of emails to your email account, and you have to keep up with it. and you have a group of experts in a variety of fields. I was wondering whether you thought of using an AI system, including a group of people who are experts in data science and big data. And the advantage is you can compile all the questions because they will be finite in number based on the number of questions you are going to get from your group of people who ask you questions. And that may lead to more policy making decisions that you can arrive at. For example, if so many people are vaccine deniers, what will be the burden on our healthcare system? Or if the mothers don't allow their children to be vaccinated, what will be a burden on our school system and on our education? And so many other policy making decisions you can make if you were to employ AI system with data science specialists and big data specialists, and you can just be in the forefront of advising our policymakers from our conversation with the large amount of population of the United States. This is what we have arrived at from the responses, from our data analysis, that we would recommend these are the policies the United States government could undertake so that we are well prepared for the next pandemic.
Yeah. I had to laugh when you said it's a finite number of questions. It doesn't feel finite. It feels literally infinite. I mean, just every day there's something new. We are working on a project right now. So we're also researchers. And so we are doing a little bit of research on our own data. And we're working on a project right now. We're trying to use an natural language processing to identify the themes in the questions we've received and how they've evolved over time. I don't think we have the reach, Raj, into the general public that would really help us, estimate like how, if we get this many questions about this theme, what does that imply about the general public and how they feel about it? Because our audience is actually very selected. Our audience is it's almost entirely women, and it's mostly women who are college educated, which is, I didn't get into who our audience is and how we think about that, but I don't think that we could really infer a ton about the general population from the questions that we've gotten from that subset of people. But the themes that we get in the questions are really, really interesting. And that project has some preliminary results, and I hope there will be a paper about it sometime relatively soon.
Can you say anything about the difference with your colleagues from Britain and what they are getting from their folks in the United Kingdom compared to what you and your American colleagues are getting?
You mean in terms of questions?
Yeah, or questions, concerns.
Well, so it's hard to compare people from the UK because that's not a obviously distinct audience, the way that we receive the questions, but we can compare the questions that we get on Querida Pandemia, which is our Spanish language mirror site, to the questions that we get in our English site. And they are very different. And our audiences on those two platforms are very different as well. And it is really interesting to compare the audiences, compare the audience needs, compare the way that the audiences engage with us is quite different. And in addition to that, the information landscape is really different. In Spanish, we're learning that it's even hard for clinicians to find good information to inform themselves in Spanish. So there's really, we have a number of readers in Spanish who tell us that they're physicians in family practice and they can't find any good, well-vetted information on whether ivermectin works or not. And so we're providing a much more, it's a really different landscape on our Spanish site than it is on our English site. Querida Pandemia is our highest priority for growing, and in part That's because it's going to be a really long time before the pandemic is over in Latin America and other Spanish-speaking parts of the world. So I think it's really important that we engage in that work and get some good info out there too.
Raj, can I ask if you've got any family or friends in India? And if so, what you're hearing from them?
Yeah, I spoke to my sisters in India, and they present a situation which is horrific with lot of suffering. And one of my sisters are saying there are not enough crematoriums to cremate the bodies. This is in a place called Bangalore, which is part of South India. And one of my other sister was weeping because her servant didn't show up because she was afraid of COVID, and all the markets were closed. And so my sister didn't know how to shop for food, and great difficulties. And both of them described that the Indian people are suffering a lot, and there is utter suffering all over the country. And I'm sitting here, I don't know what to do. And I donated whatever I could to an organization which was sending aid to the Indian citizens. And that's all. Other than praying, I have no other way to help them. And it is just horrible. I never seen. And both my sisters are blaming the politicians, especially the Prime Minister of India, for not doing the right thing. And he was campaigning with thousands and thousands of people without masks just 3 weeks ago. And he also promoted millions of Indians to go to the Ganges River to celebrate a festival. And none of them were wearing masks. They came from all over India, and they went back to their cities and villages carrying all the infections with them. So the whole healthcare, I believe, has broken down infrastructure. There is virtually no healthcare now, and thousands of deaths. And this is happening right in the capital city of New Delhi. So you can imagine what happens in other places. The whole thing is very tragic.
Jeez. Thanks for letting us know, Raj. Hope your family does okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry to hear that. It's the situation there is really devastating. And I think one of the real tensions that we have right now in this country is this tension between feeling like it's almost over, we're almost there here. And a lot of Americans are just awakening to this idea that in fact it's not almost over. It's a pandemic is a global problem. And the United States and other high income countries bought up all the vaccines. And so there aren't any vaccines to go to India and the rest of the world.
Have you done any text analysis on Dear Pandemic just to look at the I's and the we's that you get?
No. I would love to.
Do you see a lot of I's versus we's?
You mean in the questions?
Yes.
I don't know. I've never looked. I'll go look.
Well, I just put a search engine, an engine from James Pennebaker, and you can put up to 500 words. And then I think you can buy the whole version for like $85. I'm looking at a paper using that for a conference. But then you asked about Spanish, and then I put a reference to Spanish. That's a whole different translation.
Yeah. So we are, I often joke that we've been flying this plane while we're building it all this time. And the plane finally is like in pretty good shape, and somebody seems to be navigating it. And now we're all kind of looking around at each other like, okay, well, so we've written, I don't know how many tens of thousands of words over these past 15 months, and we have all these followers, and now we should maybe do some research. So we're just starting to sort out what to do with with all of our own data. I saved both those links, and I will just pop the question box contents in there and see what comes out of it. Our followers are selected to be people who, I mean, they choose to follow us. We don't there's no random process on social media. And so the people who follow us are people who care about public health enough to follow a COVID-19 public health page. And so my guess is that we'll see an unusually high number of we's relative to what we might see elsewhere.
Bia, would you read the comment from Tom Kinsel?
Yeah, Tom asked, Raj, what organization did you send support to? I'd like to help.
So if Raj peeled off, I'll ask him on email.
Uh,
Oh, there he is.
I sent it through an organization in New York, and the Indian government is very particular in allowing charities to help them. It's a very strange policy. And so I tried first American Red Cross, and they didn't have anything for donation for the Indian COVID-19 victims. And I tried other organizations in the United States because I was afraid if I were to send money, the corrupt officials in India may swallow the money. So I then decided to contact an organization in New York City, and it's actually a temple and a very reliable organization. And so they sent me an email, and I said, well, what guarantee do I have that you are going to send the money that you collect that will go to the Indian people? And they said 200% guarantee, we are sending it to a central organization and it will go. So I trusted them because I dealt with them before. And so that's the organization I sent to. And it's a temple. It's a temple organization. And so I sent it through them because I have no other avenue to send it because of the stringent regulation by the Indian government. They don't allow outside organization to deal with any charity organization in India. So it's a very strange policy, and that's the situation I'm in. So that's what I did.
Thank you, Raj. It's about 8:45. I bet Malia's got things she's got to do. If there's any other pressing questions?
Can you hear my foster cats? They're getting hungry.
Yeah, I didn't want him to come. Oh.
Sorry about that. I
five
share my
cats.
office with a small family of cats, and they're foster cats, and they're making a bunch of noise right now.
Yep. Thank you very much, Malia. Thanks for staying on for so long to field questions and offer insights.
Great conversation. Thank you for joining me.
I really, really appreciate it. And as you're writing those grant proposals, especially on plain language and extension kind of work, I'd be delighted to participate in any of that if you think the kinds of stuff that I do would be helpful.
Yeah.
It'd be great to have
I'll reach out to you on that.
The 4-H connection with all that too.
Yeah.
Great. One last thing, Bia mom graduated on Sunday. I want to make sure the folks that are still on can lift a little glass for Bia. And I hope she gets to work with us throughout the summer. And it's been one of the great things of the spring is getting to work with Bia on Wednesday night at the lab. So. All right. Thank you, everybody, and talk with you soon.
You need to hunt up your Bia replacement so Bia can train her over the summer. If she gets into med school, she'll be too busy next fall.
Well, so last night I heard there's a 4-H, a woman who's here at UW-Madison who's a freshman, going to be a sophomore, and she's a 4-H alum from Waukesha County. And so I was asked my colleague, could you send me that person's name so we could have the same kind of great situation we have when Bia comes on and does a 4-H thing and says, I too started as a 4-H'er when I was 3.5 years old. How old were you, Bia?
I was 7.
Okay, well, I was only off by a factor of 2, so that's good.
Actually, not too bad. Yeah.
So yeah, but that'll be very good. All right, thanks again, everybody, for coming on, and see you next week.
Yep.
All right, bye.